all the things that can be involved in some of these studies. Okay, so today what we're going to do is talk about different kinds of the requirements for different kinds of data, and some, I should say, specialized data collection is really what it is. So I've got some examples up in the CCLE, but I'll pull them up here too. So the first is I want to talk a little bit about designing surveys. And this is true mostly for surveys, although some of the issues have to do with just forms overall. But the first is readability, and readability applies there's lots of aspects to readability. So first of all, you need to make sure that the literacy level is appropriate for whoever you are designing your form for. And it's hard to get to, but kind of the standard is to say to at least try to get things, if you can, to an 8th grade reading level. If you try to go for a high school reading level, you sometimes may be using phrases or words that are more difficult for some people to do. It's hard to get to that sometimes, but that's something that you should try to work for. I forgot to bring, there's different things online that you can submit something and it tells you what the reading level is. I forgot to, I'll make myself a note to get those resources. Then the next thing is you need to think about the people who, you need to think about font size. So with older adults, sort of the standard has kind of become 14-point font or bigger because you just don't know what someone's visual limitations might be. But that may be true for, we may be saying geriatric patients, but that may not be broadly enough. You may need to think about anybody who's 50 and older, particularly those who may not feel comfortable getting bifocals or something.
I think everyone likes bigger.
Yeah, that's right. I have a particular preference for whether it's a font that's serif or sans serif. I prefer the sans serif, so a much cleaner, modern look. But I know a lot of people who prefer something like Times New Roman because they think that it looks more business-like. So I don't think that there's, if you start going, you can dive deep into some of these kinds of things if you start trying to look for design factors. But just use something that seems clean enough to you. If you're working with kids, you really need to think carefully about the readability. One option that people often use with children for putting like a Likert scale down is either a series of faces with a variety of expressions or other, that's what I've seen most commonly, but there's also some other things out there too, so that kids have problems. Not every kid has good number sense, depending on how old they are. And not every kid will be able to read well, and they may not tell you that they don't understand your form. So if you're not using a form that's already been worked through with kids for them to be administering themselves, you may want to do a little bit more testing than you might otherwise, just to be sure that it's working well. Then the other thing you want to look at when you're designing surveys is how much time does it take to complete the survey. So you want to probably take the time that it takes you to complete the survey and multiply that at least by 50%, if not 100%, for how long it's going to take somebody who doesn't know your study to take the survey. I think that I certainly am familiar with studies that use very, very long surveys, but when they do that, they find ways to structure breaks. So a good example is Midas. They send this big, gigantic booklet out to people and ask them to take the book. And I think it must take people an hour and a half to fill that whole thing out. But you go through a set of items and it says, this is a good time to take a break if you would like. You can come down and pick it up, but they send it to somebody's home. So what you're doing is you're giving them the freedom to control the amount of time that they're using to take the survey. If you have somebody captive, they've come to a visit, clearly you can do a little bit, you can have them spend a little bit more time. I sort of think the upper limit is about 25 minutes. If your survey's longer than 25 minutes, you may want to think about either breaking it up, so giving it in a couple of different ways, or looking at whether there's some ways you can trim it down. People love surveys that take them 5 minutes. I very rarely have had a survey that really only takes me 5 minutes, and it's usually just like the ones from the hotel. And even then, right, they start getting into annoying questions about, did you like our bed linen? I'm like, I don't care.
I'm impressed you can answer this.
Well, sometimes I do, only because I feel like I have to support the business. And then you want to consider the platform in which you're administering the survey. So paper forms are designed differently than scan forms, designed differently than online forms. Paper forms, you have to be very explicit about what your skip patterns are, so you may want to use arrows. It's hard to direct people across the pages, so it's hard to say go from question 5 to question 23. That's very difficult for people to do. But sometimes you can do things like use different colored paper, and that can often be a way, or you can already have a marker in there that says go to this mark.
Like you would say, like turn to the green pages or something like
exactly.
that.
Okay. Totally. Yeah. You have to think about the color blindness of people, but to use the right color. But
what kind of color? But could you also use kind of hyper indenting, so it's very clear that this is like a child of this parent question?
Totally. So I really like drawing a box around.
If you enter no, you're good outside the box.
Exactly. I think boxes and arrows are super, super helpful to people.
Like, yes, you go here. No, you go straight down.
Keep going, right. Turn the page. Turn the page. In big letters, turn the page.
Yeah.
Not helpful for the person coding.
Now the person...
helpful for the person...
Right.
The person that says no and they should jump these questions, some of them will answer all those questions. You just dump that. You assume the first is correct and you dump the other answers?
Well, you don't dump it because you never know if you're going to look at it later.
Okay.
Right.
But in the analysis you would...
So in analysis, we're going to talk about this when we talk about coding and stuff like that. In the analysis perspective, you actually prefer that everyone answers all questions. So the skip pattern is really for the benefit, I think, of the participant. Because I would rather know, personally for me, I would rather them answer every single question, even if it's not relevant seemingly for them. But assuming there will be skip patterns, because there will be, right? You don't want to kind of waste their time.
Right.
Then if they answer whatever, it may be useful later, it may not.
Right. So they may have misunderstood your original question, marked no, and then looked at it and said, well, I can answer those questions.
Right. So for example, if you say never smoker,
right.
Yeah.
And then you skip, they might say, I do smoke 5 cigarettes a day. They're no longer a never smoker, so you're actually going to utilize that information probably. You have to make a decision if you want to utilize this or not. Probably will, because they probably didn't lie on the 5 cigarettes a day.
Right.
So, you don't want to throw it out.
Yeah. So you want to take a look at it. You want to evaluate it.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was a very good question, actually. Yeah. I forget to say that stuff sometimes. So then scan forms are a different issue. So with scan forms, sometimes the scan form can be set up so that the question is on the form and you can be just bubbling there. But sometimes, as you probably recall from tests and stuff, people will do surveys and they want you to just, the questions are here and the bubble are here. And so in that case, you have to think very clearly for people about how are they filling out the bubble form. So when you set up your paper form that they're working from, or if they're looking, you want to be able to help guide them through it. Online forms, we have the advantage that that we can go ahead and hardwire skip patterns. So the advantage is people don't even see questions, but then the disadvantage is people don't even see questions that they would realize that they want to answer. But online ones can be tricky. So one of the things in particular you want to think about with online forms, and I think we talked about this already, but you want to have a way that people can save and come back, because not everybody can finish a survey right away. The other thing that you want to be able to do is to quickly have a way that they can let somebody know that they're having problems. So you want to have a help or a contact us or whatever, because they are distant from you and they won't be motivated to call you. And then you also want to look at how much scrolling happens. So, you know, we're all getting very familiar with a lot of this stuff right now. And I find it annoying to have to scroll through a page if I'm answering a survey. So I actually put a lot more breaks in my online surveys than I do in my other surveys, because I think it also gives you that idea that you're making progress. You can't see how many pages you're turning. There's some debate about whether that progress bar is good or bad. On long surveys, it's not good because you don't make enough progress quickly enough. But what we have found is similar to what Midas does with the paper study, paper form, is that if you give you're doing great, keep going. We've got a lot so far, and you're almost done. You have 10 more minutes to go, but you're almost done. You need to think about those sorts of things with the online survey. The other thing is that, as we talked about before when we were talking about form design, you need to think about giving them the option to indicate that they don't want to answer a question. So that if you give people the option to just skip an item that they don't want to fill out, then you never know why. You will end up with a lot more missing data. So if you can, try to give an option for that. So what I wanted to do was to take a look at an actual survey and get you guys to take a look at it and see what you think about it. So this was a survey that was drafted, and this is on the CCLE site too. It's called Geriatric Survey. So this was one that was designed to be given to patients that came to the geriatrics clinic to get their opinion about stuff. So first of all, let's take a look at, I'm going to zoom it down and then we'll zoom it up. So they fit it all on one page. So is that good? Yes, that's great, because then you're not asking somebody to turn over. You're not going to miss data because people forgot to turn it over. Okay, but what would be some things that you think are issues here?
Font's too small.
Exactly, font's too small. You got to have 14 at least. What about those check boxes? They're pretty hard to see, right? And would you have, if someone put an X here, would you think it was for return visit or was it for Alzheimer's? They're all jammed up together. And you're asking people to read all the way across. It says, to improve our care, we're conducting a survey of patients at the end of their visits. That sounds a little impersonal, right? And then these questions are sort of vague.
What part seems too impersonal?
The question that says we're conducting a survey of patients at the end of their visits. It's just a little we're not as much about, we're asking you
I see.
about your
I see,
visit.
yeah.
You know, you're a patient, so.
I see.
And then if we scroll down, you can see that we have the same issue here. Here's a skip pattern without any arrows or anything, right? If no, return the survey. If yes, what would you like to do? Here's little bitty skip pattern, little bitty check boxes again. So, and then information, name, phone number, email address. Formatted in kind of a funny way. Like, why is the blank on the left instead of on the right? Right? Okay. So let me show you an example of what I did as a reboot of this survey. And I didn't do everything, but I gave them back some comments. Okay, so I'll show you and then we can change some of it. But so first of all, I made everything 14 point font, right? And then to help us do this, we already say what it is we want to do. We are asking you and other patients what we can do better. Okay, so it's really getting their buy-in to what you're doing and not as impersonal a piece. Then here's where readability is an issue. The survey is voluntary. What does that mean? We need to be explicit. They said voluntary and anonymous. What does anonymous mean? So I provided a definition of voluntary. Voluntary is mean you don't have to complete it to see your doctor. So of course you want to reassure people that taking the survey, their care does not depend on them taking this survey. And then anonymous, who can tell what that word is in writing, right? So you don't need to provide your name, and I even probably should have said you don't have to put your name on the form, right? I mean, as I look at it now, provide is maybe even too big a word. And then unless you indicate, unless you would like to become involved. So you can see, put your ideas down first, that's great, and then come back to it and say, all right, how can I make this even simpler? And this is the time when reading it out loud really helps, because you're like, well, your tongue would get all garbled. Okay, so then asking people, is this a first-time visit or a return visit? Well, let's make it a simpler question. Is this the first time you've come to our clinic? Yes, no. That's what we mean by a return visit. So again, simplifying the question, being very specific. And then people don't know the difference between primary care and consultation. So I'm here to see my primary or main doctor, or to consult with a doctor who is not my primary one. Just makes it a little bit clearer. And to see one of the providers in the Alzheimer's dementia care program. That's why they're there. They're not there for the ADCP program. They're there to see a provider. Okay. Then what went right? What a vague question. What you want to know is, what did people do well? So what did the staff and doctors do well? That's what you want to ask. And then you can see down here, if yes, please tell us how you would like to help, and what programs or services would you like to help with. And if you'd like to help us, please give us your contact info. So minor tweaks, and I can already see other things that I would change and to make it even better, but you see the point that I'm trying to make. So this is critical to getting the data that you want. You want to go over and over and over these surveys and make sure that you're really asking the things that you want. Now, I work with some folks that are up in education. One of the things that they say about surveys is that in one survey, if you have a scale, so like strongly disagree to strongly agree, that you should always use the same scale throughout the entire survey. Don't show them one with 5, one with 7, one with 10. I disagree a little bit. I think that people generally can make that transition, but it's a good reminder that you want to be presenting people the same kinds of response items as much as you can. Now, maybe not everything can be a strongly disagree to a strongly agree item. You may need to ask something about confidence or something else, but it's a good thing to remember that you get people in a response mode, and it's easier for them to continue to respond that way because they understand the scale that's presented to you.
Is there some sort of consensus? I've read that there's some problems with different scales, right? Like some of them have sort of bias to the middle, and some of them bias towards the extremes. As generally speaking as we can, is there some sort of 2019 consensus about what is 0 to 10 appropriate for, or the strongly disagree to strongly agree?
So I don't know that I've seen any specific literature, and I'll make a note to see if I can find anything. What I know from my psych training is that lots of times you get more than 5 points and people can't distinguish between what's the difference between 3 and 4 and 5. Well, I'm sorry. Let's say you had a 7-point scale. Sorry. What's the difference between 3 and 4? 2, 3, and 4. That's a little tough to decide. What are those differences? So if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2 means you're between the extreme and the middle. 4 means you're between the middle and the extreme, right? I think that people have a very hard time answering ones that have even numbers so that there's no middle. But that's just a gut from my reaction from how I've seen people respond. So lots of people like to drop that because they want to force people to go either towards the agree side or the disagree side. So they'll only do 4 options. I'll never put a neutral in the middle. And what do you label? Do you label it neutral? Who knows what neutral means? That doesn't seem right. It means neither agree or disagree, or you don't want to say, I can't make up my mind, or I don't know. That's different than saying, I could be going either direction. So,
so there's no.
What you want to do, though, as much as you can, is use the scale that's the way it's been published, because that's how it's been validated. It's fine to make a change, but you have to make the change systematically and have data to show that your change was, and we often don't have the opportunity to do that.
Okay.
So, yeah. But I think 0 to 10s are like crazy. I just don't think people can differentiate those well enough. So, again, that's my opinion. But I'll take a look and see if I can find, there's got to be a bunch of stuff out there about it. So good question. All right, so that's it on surveys for now. In terms of the items that you'll pick, and that's really up to you. You just really want to think carefully about using your survey real estate for the information that you most want to have from somebody. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about focus groups. So have either of you been involved with focus groups, or have you had focus groups as a research activity before? Do you know what I mean by a focus group? Kind of, sort of.
I know what you mean.
Vaguely, I think.
So I mean, it's the best example for focus groups comes from advertising, of course, where they'll ask people about a bunch of products and their opinions. Focus groups are often a very good way to gather some preliminary information as you're going into a new research field. So I'm actually in the process right now of working with some folks to plan focus groups around talking to patients and caregivers of folks that have pressure ulcers, about what kind of involvement they want, how much responsibility they want to take for their own care. So before we start going through and designing something, we want to make sure that we've heard adequately what all the issues are. So focus groups involve probably at least, it's good to try to get 3. If you can get 5, that's probably better in terms of the number of people that you would want to talk with. You can go as many as 10, but you guys all know this. The more people you get, then you're going to have some people who don't say anything. And, there is the focus group of 1, and that's called a structured interview. So it's certainly possible to talk to people individually, but you often get in a focus group, you have to be careful that you don't let one person dominate the focus group, but you can often get some consensus. So someone who maybe didn't think to say something or was shy about saying something, if somebody else brings it up, then you'll get their feedback as well. It doesn't work to just go in and say, okay, so I want to talk about this stuff. You want to have a guide. So you want to thought through carefully, what are the questions that you want to ask? How do you want to pose the problem? And then what are the questions that you want to ask them to do? Focus groups definitely need a facilitator, and the facilitator is the person who is encouraging the conversation, basically. I don't want to say leading the group exactly, but is guiding their conversation. But you want to have ways that you can capture this information too. So being the facilitator, it's very difficult to also be the note taker. So it's helpful to have a second person there who can be the note taker. It may be notes that are being made on a tablet, but it might also be notes that are being made publicly as people are mentioning things. Lots of times the facilitator will do the big post-it board, and then you've got somebody in the back who's writing everything down. It's helpful then to also have a recording. So having notes and having a recording. And then from the recording, you can have transcription. So the most thoroughly done focus groups have a facilitator, have a separate note taker. They're also recording it. The recording goes off for the transcription. All of those folks come together to contribute to the information that you gain from it. And then what you're going to do from the focus groups is you're going to code those transcripts for themes. So we'll talk about that. Oh, no, that's in the next slide. Sorry, I have an example focus group I'll show, focus group guide. So how do you code transcripts for themes? And this is also the same kind of process that you would use for any open-ended items that you might have in an interview or with a survey. You first want to develop what you think are the possible list of themes. It doesn't mean that it's going to be the be-all and end-all. Hopefully you actually find some new themes, otherwise the focus group maybe wasn't as helpful as it could have been. And then that as the new themes get added, you want to make sure that everybody who's doing the coding for themes is being made aware of the new things that you want to add. So, for instance, an example would be for this study with the pressure ulcers. So we would find we would expect there to be a theme. I don't know what to do. So there's information that I need. We would expect that we would find that there would be a theme that sometimes me and my medical team don't agree. I wish that there was something that I wish that there was some technology that I could use. So those would all be themes that we would likely find as we go through this focus group. Then, when you're doing the coding, what you're going to do is you're going to have the transcript in front of you, and you want to maybe an Excel file where you have your list of themes, and you're going to indicate that you found this theme in this particular interview, or in this particular focus group, sorry. Well, you want to be able to go back to where in that transcript you did it. So you want to have your transcript have line numbers so that when you code to themes, you can say lines 38 through 40 is where we found them talking about their caregivers' attitudes. Or it was in 38 to 40, it was in 50 to 55, So it allows you to be able to go back. Why? Because it may be that as the theme coding evolves, you actually have to return to some stuff that you coded earlier because you realize, oh, this is something that should actually be broken apart. Does that make sense? And then before you have anybody coding, before you have anybody going through and just coding on their own, you want to have the coders, that should say coders, have the coders practice to make sure that they're agreeing about what theme should be. So you might take, for instance, the first 3 transcripts and have them all 3 code and compare their coding so that they're all coming up with the same answers. Okay, then when you're really getting into your coding, you want to have them, at least 2 of them work independently, so they're not talking to each other. So you're getting completely independent codes of all the themes in your transcript. And then you want to take a look and see, did they find the same themes? And the third person serves as the adjudicator. So you'll go through and compare. So there were some interviews that we did with people who had tried to institute an intervention in their clinical practices. And so we had 2 people who did the codes, then all 3 of us got on the phone together, and I served as the adjudicator. So I would hear, why did you code it this way? Why did you code it that way? And then we would adjust the themes based on that conversation. So it allows you to make sure that you're getting some independently done observations, and then you adjudicate together. Does that make sense? Okay. So let me go into the caregiver, and this is also something that's up on the CCLE. So these were focus groups that were being done with Alzheimer's patients and their caregivers. So there was one guide for the patients and another focus group guide for the caregivers. They did different focus groups. So you can see, and this is a very brief one. It's not super detailed, but there's an introduction. So you're telling them, why are you here? This is what we're trying to do, and this is what we would like your help with. We made sure to tell people that we were taping the session so that they knew that there was a recording being made of them, and everybody had to sign a consent form. So everybody has to consent to be part of the focus group. Then there's a little bit in here about explaining the rules. So one person talks at a time. Don't talk over somebody. And that it's okay if you don't answer something. And then you note that we say, please only use first names. Well, that's just a way in which to try to protect confidentiality. And then giving them the expectation of how long the focus group would last. 2-hour-long focus group with Alzheimer's patients is a lot. That's tough. I can't remember if they actually went that long or not. They may have. So then you can see the facilitator restates the goals and transitions into topics. And so then these are the topics that would be presented to people. So you start off, what are the important goals for your care? What are medical goals? What are social goals? So explaining what each of these things are, giving people the opportunity to share that. Then, are there situations that you wouldn't want to, care situations you wouldn't want to be in? And is there a difference between your goals and those of your caregivers? You're not going to throw all those questions out at once. you go through question 1, you spend about 15-20 minutes on that. It gets people warmed up. And then you go on to question 2 and question 3. And then what the wrap up and closing is. So not super complicated, but clear enough that you know that the focus groups will generally be run the same way. And then for the caregivers, it's similar, but you can see the topics are they're still looking at goals of care, but you're asking them, of course, what are the differences between your goals and the patient's goals, and what do you think ones cannot be compromised? So slight difference in the questions, but very similar. Yeah. You look like you have a question.
Oh, no,
Okay.
Now I got it.
Okay. So just an example of what a focus group is. If you're going to do focus groups, this is the kind of thing that IRB is going to want to see. They want to see what your guide is. What are you telling the facilitator you're going to work through? Some focus groups guides are very, very detailed and can be multi-pages long. This is only a couple of pages. It depends on what all you're trying to dig into. Okay. So that's it on focus groups. Now we're going to talk about when you're observing behavior. There's different research projects. It may be that you're wanting to observe the staff. So are staff doing particular things in a unit? Or you want to observe participants. You want to see what people's reactions are to a particular intervention or device or something. One of the things you want to do is you want to make sure that you list the behaviors that you want to observe. So we did some stuff with kids where we brought them in and showed them a particular video. We were wanting to see their reaction to it. So we had a series of classifications that we want to know: how often did they smile, how often did they seem surprised, how often did they yawn. So these kinds of behaviors. You can also do that. Those were largely facial expressions. With staff, you may want to see how often do they engage the patient, how often do they wash their hands, do they always put gloves on before going to work with a patient, those kinds of things. So figure out the behaviors that you're looking for, and then you're going to want to have a way in which you can record the frequency that it happens. And so this is where you're going to largely have a form. You can either sit and observe people, like just watch them for 2 hours. That's one way to do it. And you basically have a tick mark for each of the things that you see. The other way to do observation is to come to a unit periodically. So maybe come between 7 and 8 in the morning, between 7 and 8 at night, and you walk around and you see what can you observe. And sometimes that's more, you're wanting to see, how many patients are asleep, how many nurses are actually caring for patients versus doing chart work. There's a lot of different kinds of things that you may want to be able to observe with folks. And then in order to standardize the observations, multiple coders, I don't know why I can't type the word coder today, but you need to have multiple coders need to be trained so that you can, if you've got multiple coders, you need to train them so they're agreeing about what they're seeing. So you would have 2 people in there observing the same time to get them to agreement, right? And then you would compare their level of agreement. If they aren't agreeing well, meaning like 95% or better, then you'd want to rehearse where there are discrepancies. So maybe someone is not, one person may be, let me think of an example. I can't think of an example right now. Shoot. Sorry. Brain is just frozen there for a minute. But you can imagine that there might be a situation where one person sees one thing and another person sees another thing. And so you just want to make sure that they're going to come to agreement. So these are the kinds of things that you want to look at in behavioral observation. So let's look at an example there. So here is the MediSense form. So oops, I keep clicking my Outlook. This was an observational study in nursing homes, and the MediSense was it was this sensor pad that you put in folks' beds, and it would allow you to see how often are they turning, how are they moving, that kind of thing. So we needed to see, in order to understand our data, we needed to observe each of these patients. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. We needed to observe patients to know what we saw them doing so that we could then link it to the MediSense data that we would get off of the sensors. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have a chart, and so you can see that we determined various things about their behavior. So where were they in bed? Were they asleep? What care processes were happening? And were they engaged with anybody? So those kinds of behaviors, and you can see that we looked from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So we had somebody look at them every hour to see what is that patient doing. And here's some further explanation of what the engagement meant. So you wouldn't have someone both asleep and engage with facility staff, probably, right? But you could be asleep either in your bed, in your wheelchair, right? There's different places where you could be asleep. And you could be asleep in a variety of places. And so that would give us information. So unfortunately, this was a great behavioral study, but the stupid sensor thing didn't work at all. So much for that. But you can see you can see the kinds of things that you would want to do for a behavioral form. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. So we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about biomarkers. And biomarkers have their own unique place in research, but they can be super important, obviously, in the research that we conduct here. So one of the first questions is how to decide what biomarker to use. It's the same sort of thing that we were talking about last week about looking at your resources. So the first question is what the scientific considerations are. Is there a biomarker that you need to collect because it is your primary outcome? But also, is there one that you need to collect to be able to rule out competing hypotheses? So those scientific considerations are super important. Start there, dream big. Come up with whatever you can about the biomarkers that you want to measure, and then trim your list after that. Then your next thing that you need to consider is your cost. Do you have the money to do what you need to do with the biomarker? It may be that you have the money to collect it, but you don't have the money to analyze it. You want to make it's always great to go ahead and collect. If you think that it's completely unfeasible that you would ever get the money to be able to analyze it, well, then it's kind of a waste for somebody. But if you think that there's the slimmest chance that you might be able to get some money to analyze it, then collect it. After you've looked at the scientific and cost considerations, then see how feasible is it to actually collect it. So there are things that we would love to get from people, but it turns out that it's not as feasible. Technology is helping us a lot with this, and so there's a lot more things that we can do. But you can't have a phlebotomist show up at somebody's house at 10 o'clock at night right before they go to bed and do a blood draw. so that you get their before bed blood, right? That's very unlikely. Now, you could do it if you ask them to stay overnight in the hospital or in a sleep clinic, but you're not going to send phlebotomists, probably not going to send them out to some people's houses at 10 o'clock at night. Then you need to think about, how does the biomarker integrate with your timeline? So it's, you want to make sure that you measure the biomarker at the point where you can make some scientific, you can test your hypotheses appropriately. So you don't want to measure your biomarker too early or too late. And so depending on what you're looking at, that you may have some wiggle room. You may be able to measure something within 7 days. If you're looking at salivary cortisol, you got to measure first thing in the morning, and you got to get it first thing in the morning. Getting it at 3 hours after somebody has gotten up is not that helpful. And then you want to consider what type of measure you're looking at. So you're looking at a specimen, or are you looking at an image as a biomarker? The specimens that I'm familiar with are blood, urine, saliva, skin, hair, and nails. And then these variety of imaging technologies, but there's probably some that I haven't even thought of to put on there that would also be, in fact, I don't have X-ray on there, and we know that X-rays are very common images, right? So those are all biomarkers because they're all telling you something about someone's biological state. Once you've chosen your biomarkers, then you need to find a laboratory and a reading center. And there's different considerations that you can have. There's nothing wrong with going with a commercial lab or a commercial reading center. You just want to make sure that you are clear about what your commitment is and any kind of whether it's just on a contract basis and you retain the right to all the images or specimens. Academic labs will often do the unusual things, but they may not be as experienced, and so you may end up with more difficult getting your specimens assayed, for instance. So for sure you want to find out, do they have experience with the specific assay that you want done? Doesn't mean that you can't use somebody that doesn't have that experience, but you want them to not practice on your samples. So if they say, we haven't ever done it before, then you say, okay, let's get some pilot stuff before I spend $400,000 on this assay with you. Then you need to find out, can they do it in the timeline that you need it done, right? So we've all seen this where you have this fantastic bank of samples and they're like, well, we can't get to it for 6 months because we're working through this other thing, and it means we have to rearrange our whole analyzer and everything. So just make sure that they think that they can do it in the timeline that you need it done, both when you can pay them, right? Because if you have a grant and the grant ends, then your money goes away and you can't pay them. But also in terms of the time that you need it. Sometimes biomarkers are important for deciding eligibility. And if that's the case, then you need to make sure that they can process your sample in a way that's quick enough that you can determine whether someone's eligible for the study. However, if you're wanting to just look at change in cholesterol over time, then it's maybe permissible to go ahead and store all your samples and wait and do the assays after everybody's done, because then it's going to be more cost efficient to run all the assays together. And then you want to find out, are they participating in any national or international monitoring systems? And so I think that is, it doesn't necessarily mean high quality, but it means they at least acknowledge that there's a monitoring system out there. And then once you look at all of this, then your list may change. either they'll say, we can't, you cannot find somebody to do a particular assay, or the only person that does it is in Lowell, Massachusetts, and the shipping everything there is going to be a headache. But they may also say, well, if we do these two things, then we can do this third thing too for very low extra cost. And you'd be like, oh, awesome. All right, we're going to add that assay. And sometimes that happens. So looking on campus first is the best way to go, because they're going to have a commitment to doing your work, and there's ways there's ways in which to arrange the funding and sometimes pressure to get work done. So I've got here the link to the pathology portal. So are you guys familiar with the pathology portal? Have you ever used it? Let me just show you real quick. This is who will do all your assays for you. Well, not all of them, but you can find out if they do them. Here's their link, and so they'll give. This is the list of everything that they'll do. So they do anything that's in the UCLA lab manual, and then this is the pricing for how you need to set up your different stuff. So the non-UC rate is for for looking at some commercial clinical trials.
That's commercially funded clinical trials, even if they're run by UC faculty.
I think, no, wait, let me see. It says UC industry. I'm sorry, it says UC industry for profit. And yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
You know what? I am now looking at this and I'm not sure. If you're doing like an NIH grant, there's a lot of this stuff that they'll waive for you. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot more of this that they're actually charging. They are doing a lot more charge than they used to. So you can see this is all the different stuff. So this is great, because if you're trying to put together your budget, you can figure out how much it's going to cost. And then if you want to know how much your assay is going to cost, just send them this information and they'll give you a quote for how much the assay is going to cost per person. So it's great. Then they have this, how to use PRP. There's an application that you need to send in. I find these guys to be super, super helpful. They're really good at what they do. They're familiar with a lot of things. And so they're not perfect, but I find them to really try to be accommodating whenever they can. And then the other link is to the radiology research programs. Okay, so the other things you have to think about with biomarkers is you have to think about the setting. Where are you going to be collecting this biomarker? So are you going to be doing it in a clinic? Are you going to be doing it at home or in a community setting? Depending on your location, you're going to have to possibly accommodate different things. You need to think about what equipment will be required to do the collection. So if you're doing, carotid ultrasounds, for instance, there are fairly portable ultrasound devices, but you may still want to have someone come to a clinic because you can have all of the other resources available. There's lots of ways in which you can do blood collection out in the community and in people's homes. So if you ever want to do that, let me know and I'll tell you all the different tricks that we know about that. So you want to think about that, how feasible is it, and can you get in? So let's say that you want to have people who are fasting, but they can't get into the community center till 9 a.m. Are your participants going to fast that long? Many will, but you want to think through those things. And then you want to make sure if you if you did ask them to fast, that you have a snack for them. Then you also need to think about what your participant needs to be doing. So do you need to have your participant fasting? How hydrated do they need to be? If you're getting blood from people, you want to make sure they're as hydrated as possible. Depending on different things that you may be imaging with ultrasounds, you may want to have a full bladder or an empty bladder. It depends. So those kinds of issues are different. You need to consider, is metal going to interfere with the collection of an image? Or is it going to make somebody ineligible? So those different kinds, if there's something that they can take off that's metal, do you want them to take it off? All of those things. And then think how these things fit together. So if you've got someone and you're going to do a blood draw, an MRI, and an ultrasound on them, is there an order in which it's going to be easier for them? Can you mix it up? Whatever. And then what kind of infrastructure is required for the collection? So do your staff need to have particular training or licenses? So you have to have a phlebotomy license if you're going to collect blood when there is not a physician not a physician present. An MA can collect, but only if there's a physician on site. What are the supplies and equipment that you're going to need for all of this? And then what do you need to do? What do you need to think about for quality control? Again, we've talked about quality control before, but you're going to be going all these places. Then make sure that you collect information about the collection. So what time of day was it done? And that you have these inclusion-exclusion checklists. So for sure you want to ask, is the standard, you're going to get an x-ray, take a pregnancy test. If you have metal in your body, you can't go, get a MRI, those sorts of things. Labeling, we've talked about it a little bit, but good to think about it explicitly again. Avoid PHI as much as you can. Name or initials, maybe visit date, depending, because that is PHI, or MRN. Be sure that you actually need that information on your specimen if you're going to collect it. But do include the study name, the study ID, which visit it was, and maybe use a barcode. Study name is super, super important. Can I tell you how often I've gone into a freezer and you pull out a box, it may be that the study name is written on the box, but you pull out a vial and you have no idea what study this is from. It's very simple to put the name of the study on, because, it's like, oh, I'll remember. That was my big R01. No, you won't. In 20 years, you won't remember. So anyway, put your study name on every single little thing that you collect. Think about your sample processing. So how much time between different points is acceptable? So how quickly do you have to, from collection to processing, do you have to get it? Is it something you have to spin down in 20 minutes? Or can it sit for 4 hours? Or can it sit for a couple of days? And what do you need to do to store it? So packaging tubes sit refrigerator for 24 hours and then go in a freezer. So you need to think about those sorts of things. We've talked about the step-by-step instructions before, or a chart. That's super helpful. And then the handshake or the transfer points. Think about what you're going to do there. With a log, think about whether, lots of times when you're turning stuff in to a clinical lab, they want to know the gender and age of someone. And so think about just using the same actual month and day for birth date for everybody. Just give them the year. So, and that way you're protecting PHI, right? You're not giving them date of birth. You're obscuring it just a little bit, but you're respecting what the clinical lab wants to do, which is to provide you any alerts based on someone's gender and age. Then think about supplies that are needed for the sample processing. So you need to be able to transport it safely. No longer can we just carry vials around in our hand as we're going from place to place. Make sure that you have an approved biosafe container. Think about all the equipment that you're going to need, and then think about how you're going to store things. So if you're working on images, do you want to have multiple backups? Do you want to have 2 flash drives, or do you want to have a flash drive and put everything else in the cloud somewhere? Think about how are you going to store those images so that you can later retrieve them. And then shipping. Do you need to ship? If you do, is it fresh or frozen? What kind of turnaround is required? There are day-long meetings that meet about this kind of thing. I just came back from one where we're talking about all the different shipping protocols that people use and how they may affect the specimen. And then for the storage, how much space do you need? Do you need to keep something at room temperature? So like if you have a recording device, does it need to be kept cool? Do you need to keep samples frozen? Where are you going to keep it, and who's overseeing that storage? So if you're leaving something for 5 years, who's in charge of making sure whether there's a breach there or not? If you're going to store stuff long term, make sure you have money for it, and that means money for the equipment, money for who's going to be paying attention to whether it's there, and then also money for how to manage the pulling of the samples. So if you're going with one of these big repositories, you're going to have to pay them when you want your samples pulled. So be sure that you plan for that. You need to coordinate what that long-term storage is going to be and determine that there's a location. No problem. Have a good weekend. That there's backup power, or there's something else that will, something that will protect it. And then think about how you want to efficiently retrieve things. So it may be that you organize all the samples by person. So everybody, one person's specimens are all in one box, or it may be that you're going to organize everything by wave. It kind of depends. And there's not a for sure way to do it one way or the other, but just think about it. And then put together a protocol for allowing future use of the samples. The IRB will ask this, and so you want to put together how will somebody request that they can use your samples, and what are the requirements for that data sharing. For image capture, we've talked about this before. It's all about the equipment stuff. I mean, I don't know is this an issue in dentistry where you have different kinds of imaging?
Yeah, for like the CT, the DICOM CTs, the machines are
totally
different resolutions and fields.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's a huge issue because they're so expensive. People are not willing to switch them out. So as much as you can, standardize across models. For the storage media, you want to understand both how do you archive, so what's the archive process? With DEXAs, you used to burn them onto these disks. And then how are you going to access that archive later? So it may be that it's totally obvious how you're going to store it, but you might need that machine to read the archive. And so if it's 10 years later and they've it's become obsolete. That's right. Exactly. So again, you're looking at step-by-step instructions and the pass-off. And then the shipping, physical versus digital. I mean, we now have really nice ways in which you can securely share digital files. And so I think that that's helping a lot. But back when you had physical files, sometimes we would make copies because we'd be afraid that something would get lost. So just think about different ways in which you can ship the material. And then the human subject stuff, how much specimen are you going to need? What's the risk exposure, particularly for imaging? How are you going to handle alerts or adverse events? And then making sure that people understand what it is that they're doing. So I think, didn't we talk last time or time before about if you get the alerts about when you need to tell somebody? Did we talk about that a little bit?
Did I recall?
I don't think so.
Okay, maybe, I guess it was another meeting that I was in. So, one of the things that you want to think about with alerts is how critical is the alert. So if it's something, and I think this is where commercial labs are very helpful, because they have levels of alert. So there's some things that you want to tell somebody right away. If somebody has a cholesterol of, BP is more likely. So, somebody has a BP over 200, that's something you need to get to them right away. But other stuff you can maybe tell people through a letter a week later, or some stuff you just say in a month, it'd be good for you to get hold of your physician. So just think through how important the alert is, and not everything is of the same importance. We've talked about QC last time in terms of making sure that you're documenting your assay kits, how much sample to collect, how much money do you have to spend on quality control, and then training and certifying staff. I think the last thing, let's see, this is right. Oh, and then tracking data. So make sure that you document, was the specimen collected? Was the imaging done? Is anything missing? Was there a change to the protocol? Who did it? And figure out how to link the biomarker to the participant. So when you do images, lots of times you get a serial number, and make sure that you have a way to link that serial number with the patient's ID. Sometimes you can have them both in the file, but sometimes it actually requires entering it.
But for anonymity, we need some way to connect the sample back to the patient should we find something that's wrong, for example. But for anonymity, we need like a separate file that shows who's who.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Okay. Exactly. That's exactly right. We're just about done. Feel free to come on and sit down. No worries.
I know rush till 3.
Okay. Yes, and so you want to be able to have that link between study ID and name. And you're right, that is kept in a very particular place. It is interesting, lots of imaging centers, it takes a lot of persuasion to get them to not put somebody's name on the image. You're like, no, we really just need study ID, please, just study. But we finally gotten around to it. What we finally got folks to do lots of times was to use the ID as the first name and the study as the last name. Because their software is set up that they have to type something.
Yelling at them,
right?
yeah.
But lots of times too, particularly now, labs, they put a unique barcode on every specimen. And so you just want to make sure that there's a way that you can link that barcode back to who your participant is. And there's a variety of ways in which you can do it. So you just want to make sure you can do that. And the rest of this community biomarker stuff we'll do next time because there's not enough time to talk about it here. So, all right, cool. Well, thank you for staying to the end.
Thank you. It's 2 to 1 faculty-student ratio.
Exactly. That's right. How often does that happen?
Pretty cool.
While I have you here, could I
Yep.
get feedback on since we were talking about surveys today? I
Yes.
have a survey project we're nearing submission for, so it's too late to fix